And today I'm going to explain two things. First, the cardiac cycle in terms of pressure change, and then correlate the cardiac cycle with the ECG, right? Electrocardiograms. Okay, so real off the bat, we can see that there are two parts, main parts of the cardiac cycle, ventricular systole and then ventricular diastole. Ventricles are so prominent because they are the larger chambers. However, the atrial systole, which is obviously smaller and earlier than the ventricular systole, starts the cardiac cycle. So the atrial systole, if you're looking at the ECG, it is starting right after the 25 millisecond point for the P wave, right before that. Okay, so at that point, what happens? Atrial contraction, atrial systole or systole begins. That means all the blood that was coming through the vena cavas are pushed into the ventricles. So the valves open and the ventricles are receiving all the blood. Right after atrial systole completes, that it gets its first contraction, it will relax and it will go into a long phase of atrial diastole. So now atrium is out of picture. All the action is now in the ventricles. In the ventricles, notice right that you see the ventricular contraction is preceded by this huge wave. So right at the top of the wave, or a little bit after, at the R point, QRS, so at the R point, right there is the contraction. At the contraction phase of the first part of the ventricular contraction, notice it's a closed chamber. There is no blood flowing out, just the pressure is building. So it is called isovolumic or isovolumetric contraction, meaning volume not changing. Okay, so ventricular systole, first phase, no change, just the pressure is building. So we are right at this point now in the ECG. After that, when the pressure is built high enough, you get to the valves to the aorta and the pulmonary veins open up and the blood is pushed out into the lungs and into the aorta. So this is the ventricular ejection or the second phase. Now the volume is not same, volume is reduced. So it is not an isovolumetric contraction. So after the valves open, the ventricle is now relaxing. It goes into the ventricular diastole phase. Okay, ventricular diastole meaning the ventricles are now isovolumetric relaxation. The ventricles are not receiving any blood at this point early on. They're just open chambers with no blood. And the second phase of the ventricular diastole would be the ventricular chambers filling with blood. Okay, so this is the later phase. At this point now, the blood is coming in, so the volume is increasing. So this third wave, the little wave T wave, it is because of the opening up of the chamber of the ventricle and slight relaxation. So you get this last T wave. So make sure you are updating your answers with all the terms we talked about. Atrial contraction, atrial relaxation, which is going on first. It starts at 25 milliseconds after the first impulse in the P wave. The ventricular systole starts right after the peak of the QRS. Okay, and during this time, blood is collected in the ventricle. In the early stage, it is not moving. In the later part of the ventricular systole, it is pushed out into the aorta, and right after all the blood is released, the ventricle relaxes. In the early stage of ventricle relaxation, there is no blood in the ventricle. Simply, the blood is being received into the atrium. Atrium is receiving blood, not the ventricles. At the later part, about after 110 milliseconds, the ventricle starts filling up and it is ready to go into the atrial systole again. So that was the big picture here, talking about the systematic cardiac cycle. Let's just summarize this here. So go ahead. So tell me, take a second, write down these different phases. What is this first phase, second phase, third, fourth, fifth, and this entire cardiac cycle, and come back after you have written out. All right, so once you have written out, let's see what you got for the first phase. As I always said, the atrial systole is the more longest phase. So the atrium, because being at the top and at the smaller part of the heart chambers, it goes into the diastole all the time. Diastole is relaxation. So the cycle, the cardiac cycle, at the beginning of it, the atrium is in diastole. Right after the first electrical impulse for the P wave, that's when the atrial systole happens. And after it has done the first pumping the blood into the ventricles, atrial systole is short-lived and then it's gone, and then the atrium is relaxed for the entire cardiac cycle. Okay. Now you already know that up to the top of the peak R, it's the ventricular diastole. So naturally, after the R peak, it should be ventricular systole. Excellent if you got that. So the ventricular systole lasts from the peak of the R phase up to at the end of the T phase. So notice ventricular systole is from here R up to later after T. And right after the ventricular systole, as we know, it goes into diastole, which is relaxation. And one cardiac cycle starts from the arterial diastole to the end of the ventricular dystole. So that's one cardiac cycle. Atrial systole, ventricular systole, atrial diastole, ventricular diastole. That's a cardiac cycle.